Marcus Wellington adjusted his platinum watch as he stepped out of his black Bentley. The 42-year-old tech billionaire had built his empire from nothing, creating software that revolutionized how banks process transactions worldwide. His company, Wellington Systems, was valued at $12 billion, making him one of the youngest self-made billionaires in America. But money couldn't buy him the one thing he desperately wanted: time with his 7-year-old daughter, Sophie. After his wife Catherine died in a car accident 2 years ago, Marcus threw himself into work even more, leaving Sophie in the care of various nannies. None of them lasted more than 6 months. Sophie was a bright-spirited child who seemed to drive away every caregiver with her endless questions and boundless energy. That changed 3 months ago when Grace Johnson walked into their lives. The 28-year-old woman from Atlanta had a background in early childhood education and something the others lacked: genuine patience and warmth. Grace was different. She didn't see Sophie as just another job. She saw a lonely little girl who missed her mother and needed someone who truly cared. Grace had grown up in a single-parent household herself. Her mother, Rosa, worked 3 jobs to put Grace through college. Grace understood what it meant to struggle, to work hard for everything you had. She also understood loss. Her father had died when she was 8, the same age Sophie was when she lost her mother. From the first day, Grace and Sophie connected. Grace didn't try to replace Sophie's mother. Instead, she honored Catherine's memory while creating new, happy experiences. They would spend afternoons in the garden, reading books under the old oak tree that Catherine had planted. Grace taught Sophie to bake cookies, the same recipes her own grandmother had passed down through generations. Marcus noticed the change immediately. Sophie, who had been withdrawn and angry since her mother's death, began smiling again. She started talking about her day at dinner, sharing stories about her adventures with Grace. For the first time in 2 years, his daughter seemed genuinely happy. But Marcus was so consumed with his business that he rarely interacted with Grace directly. He would leave detailed notes about Sophie's schedule and preferences, communicate through his assistant, and occasionally nod politely when their paths crossed in the hallway. Grace was efficient, professional, and seemed to genuinely care for Sophie. That was all he needed to know. What Marcus didn't know was how much Sophie had begun to depend on Grace emotionally. The little girl had started calling Grace Mama Grace when they were alone, something that both touched and worried Grace deeply. Sophie would curl up next to Grace during bedtime stories, seeking the maternal comfort she had lost. Grace found herself loving Sophie as if she were her own daughter, a feeling that both fulfilled and frightened her. Grace also couldn't help but notice how lonely Marcus seemed. Despite his wealth and success, she could see the pain in his eyes whenever he looked at Sophie. He was a good father who clearly loved his daughter, but he seemed lost, unsure how to connect with her without Catherine there to bridge the gap. Grace wished she could help him see that Sophie needed him, not just his money or the security he provided, but his time, attention, and love. The Wellington mansion sat on 5 acres in the exclusive Brookhaven neighborhood of Atlanta. The property was surrounded by high walls and sophisticated security systems, but Marcus had grown complacent about safety. His success had made him wealthy, but it had also made him a target. 3 months earlier, the FBI had warned him about a kidnapping ring that specifically targeted the children of wealthy executives. Marcus had increased security at his office but hadn't made significant changes at home, assuming the walls and alarm system were sufficient protection. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Marcus was preparing for a crucial board meeting. Wellington Systems was about to announce a merger that would double the company's value overnight. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning at his downtown office, and Marcus was running late as usual. Grace was in the kitchen preparing Sophie's lunch when Marcus rushed through, grabbing his briefcase and checking his phone. Sophie was upstairs getting dressed for school, singing a song Grace had taught her the day before. Grace, I'll be in meetings all day, Marcus said without looking up from his phone. Sophie has piano lessons at 4. The driver will pick her up from school at 3:30. Actually, Mr. Wellington, Grace said softly, I was hoping to talk to you about Sophie's schedule. She's been asking if you could come to her school play next Friday. She's playing a sunflower in the autumn festival. Marcus paused, his finger hovering over his phone screen. He could hear Sophie's voice drifting down from upstairs, happy and carefree. For a moment, he felt a pang of guilt about how much he was missing of her childhood. I'll check my calendar, he said finally. Have my assistant send you the details about the play. Grace nodded, though she could see in his eyes that he was already thinking about his next meeting. She had worked for enough wealthy families to recognize the look, the constant mental juggling of priorities where family often came last. As Marcus headed toward the door, Sophie came bounding down the stairs wearing her school uniform, a navy blue jumper with a white blouse. Her long brown hair, so much like her mother's, was braided with small sunflower clips that Grace had bought for her. "Daddy!" Sophie called out, running toward him with her backpack bouncing behind her. Marcus stopped and knelt down to give his daughter a quick hug. "Have a good day at school, Princess. I'll see you tonight." "Will you read me a story tonight? Grace and I found a new book about a girl who lives in a castle, and she has a pet dragon that's actually nice and helps people in the village." Marcus glanced at his watch and then at Grace, who was watching the interaction with a mixture of hope and concern. "We'll see, Sophie. Daddy has some important work to finish tonight, but maybe tomorrow." Sophie's face fell slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Okay, Daddy. Maybe the princess in the book can wait one more day to meet her dragon." As Marcus left for the office, Grace knelt down to Sophie's level. "You know what? How about we practice reading that story together this afternoon? That way, when your daddy does have time to read it with you, you can help him with all the big words." Sophie's smile returned, bright and trusting. "That's a great idea, Mama Grace. Do you think Daddy will like the story?" Grace's heart squeezed at the nickname, but she smiled warmly. "I think he'll love it, sweetheart, and he'll be so proud of how well you can read." Neither Marcus nor Grace realized that their morning routine had been observed. Across the street, behind the tinted windows of a rented van, 3 men had been watching the Wellington house for weeks. They had mapped out the family's schedule, identified the security weaknesses, and chosen today for their operation. The leader of the group, Vincent Caruso, was a career criminal who had spent the last 5 years in federal prison for armed robbery. He had been released 6 months ago and was desperate to make enough money to disappear before his former associates caught up with him. He owed dangerous people substantial amounts of money, and kidnapping Marcus Wellington's daughter seemed like his best chance at getting the kind of ransom that could save his life. Vincent had done his research. Marcus Wellington was worth billions, but more importantly, Sophie was his only child, his most precious possession. The plan was simple. Grab the girl when she was most vulnerable, demand a ransom of $50 million, and disappear to a non-extradition country before anyone could track them down. The other 2 men, Tommy Reeves and Luis Santos, were local criminals Vincent had recruited for their knowledge of Atlanta and their willingness to do whatever it took for money. Tommy was a former security guard who had been fired for theft and knew how to disable basic alarm systems. Luis was a driver with connections to people who could provide clean vehicles and safe houses. They had been watching the house for 3 weeks, learning the patterns. Marcus left for work between 8:30 and 9 each morning. Sophie left for school at 8:15, driven by the family's regular driver, an older man named Henry who had worked for the Wellingtons for over a decade. Grace usually went with Sophie to school and picked her up in the afternoon, but occasionally Henry would make the trip alone if Grace was running errands. Today was different. Vincent had received intelligence that Marcus would be in important meetings all day, meaning he would be distracted and less likely to notice if something was wrong immediately. They had also learned that Sophie's regular piano teacher was sick, so her afternoon lesson had been moved to Thursday. This meant Grace would likely take Sophie to the park or for ice cream, as she often did when their schedule was light. The plan was to intercept them during this outing, when they would be in public, but potentially isolated. Vincent had identified the perfect spot, a small park about 10 minutes from the Wellington house where Grace often took Sophie to feed the ducks. The park had multiple exit routes and would be relatively empty on a Tuesday afternoon. As Vincent watched Marcus drive away in his Bentley, he felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. In 6 hours, he would either be $50 million richer or dead. There was no middle ground in his world, and he had learned long ago that hesitation was the enemy of success. At 9:15, Henry drove Sophie to school in the family's Mercedes SUV, with Grace sitting in the passenger seat. Vincent noted their departure time and began the final preparations for the most dangerous day of his life. Meanwhile, at Riverside Elementary School, Sophie was settling into her third-grade classroom, completely unaware that her normal, happy day was about to become anything but ordinary. She spent the morning learning about fractions in math class and writing a story about autumn leaves in English. During lunch, she sat with her best friend Emma and talked excitedly about the school play, describing her sunflower costume and hoping her daddy would be able to come watch her perform. Grace, who had spent the morning grocery shopping and preparing for Sophie's afternoon snack, arrived at the school at 3:25, 5 minutes earlier than usual. She chatted briefly with Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, about Sophie's progress and her growing confidence in reading. Everything seemed perfectly normal. As they left the school, Sophie skipped beside Grace, her backpack decorated with small pins and her lunchbox swinging from her hand. "Mama Grace, can we go to the duck park today? I saved some crackers from lunch for them." Grace smiled and took Sophie's hand as they walked toward the car. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart. The weather is so beautiful today, and I think the ducks would love some crackers." Neither of them noticed the white van that had been parked across from the school for the past hour, or the man behind the wheel who started his engine as soon as they appeared. The Riverside Duck Park was Sophie's favorite place in the whole world. The small pond reflected the afternoon sunlight like scattered diamonds, and the old willow trees created perfect shady spots for picnics. Grace parked the Mercedes in the small lot next to the playground, noting that only 2 other cars were there, unusual for such a beautiful October day, but not concerning enough to change their plans. Sophie practically bounced out of the car, clutching her small bag of crackers and chattering excitedly about the family of ducks they had been visiting for weeks. There was Mama Duck, Papa Duck, and 3 babies that Sophie had named Sunny, Cloudy, and Rainbow because of the different colors in their feathers. "Look, Mama Grace, Papa Duck is swimming toward us already. I think he remembers me." Sophie pointed excitedly toward the pond where a large mallard was indeed paddling in their direction. Grace laughed, feeling the same joy she always did when she saw Sophie so happy and carefree. These moments at the park had become precious to both of them, a time when Sophie could just be a normal little girl, away from the massive house and the weight of being Marcus Wellington's daughter. "He definitely remembers you, sweetheart. You've been bringing him crackers every week for 2 months. I bet he tells all the other ducks about the nice little girl who visits them." They settled on their usual bench by the water's edge, and Sophie began carefully breaking the crackers into small pieces, just as Grace had taught her. "We have to make sure all the ducks get some," Sophie explained seriously. "It's not fair if the big ones eat everything and the babies go hungry." Grace watched Sophie with a mixture of love and concern. The little girl was developing such a strong sense of fairness and compassion, qualities that reminded Grace of her own mother. But she also worried about how attached Sophie was becoming to her. What would happen when Marcus eventually decided Sophie was old enough not to need a nanny? What would happen if Marcus remarried and his new wife wanted to choose her own caregiver for Sophie? These thoughts had been weighing on Grace's mind more heavily lately. She had never intended to become so emotionally invested in this job. But Sophie wasn't just a job anymore. She was like the daughter Grace had always wanted, but never thought she would have. About 50 yards away, Vincent Caruso was adjusting his position behind a cluster of oak trees. He had been watching Grace and Sophie for 10 minutes, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. The park was nearly empty except for an elderly man reading a newspaper on a bench near the playground and a woman jogging on the path that circled the pond. Vincent's plan was simple, but risky. Tommy would approach from the left, pretending to be lost and asking for directions. This would distract Grace long enough for Vincent to grab Sophie from behind. Luis was positioned in the parking lot with the van running, ready for a quick escape. The plan had one major flaw that Vincent had underestimated. He had never dealt with someone like Grace Johnson before. Grace had grown up in one of Atlanta's toughest neighborhoods. By the time she was 12, she could recognize danger from 3 blocks away. She had walked home from school past drug dealers and gang members, learned to cross the street when she saw groups of men loitering, and developed an instinct for survival that no amount of wealth or security could replace. As Sophie scattered cracker crumbs for the eager ducks, Grace noticed a man approaching them from the left. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face and had his hands in his jacket pockets, 2 things that immediately raised red flags in Grace's mind. The temperature was 78 degrees, too warm for a heavy jacket, and honest people didn't hide their faces when approaching families with children. "Excuse me," Tommy called out when he was about 20 feet away. "I'm looking for the main entrance to Piedmont Park. My GPS isn't working and I think I made a wrong turn." Grace's body tensed. Piedmont Park was on the other side of the city, at least 30 minutes away. No one would accidentally end up at this small neighborhood park while looking for Piedmont. Moreover, she had caught a glimpse of a white van in the parking lot that hadn't been there when they arrived. "Sophie," Grace said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "Come stand behind me, sweetheart." Sophie looked up from the ducks, confused by the sudden change in Grace's tone. "But Mama Grace, Rainbow hasn't gotten any crackers yet." "Right now, Sophie. Move behind me." The urgency in Grace's voice cut through Sophie's confusion. She had never heard Grace speak like that before. Not angry, but sharp and commanding in a way that meant immediate obedience was required. Tommy continued approaching, his smile too wide and his eyes darting between Grace and Sophie. "I just need directions, lady. No need to be unfriendly." Grace stepped forward, positioning herself between Tommy and Sophie, while scanning the area for other threats. Her peripheral vision caught movement near the trees, another man wearing dark clothing who was trying to circle around to their right. "Sophie, I need you to walk toward the playground right now," Grace said without taking her eyes off Tommy. "Go sit on the swing and wait for me there." "But Mama Grace—" "Now, Sophie. Go now." Sophie dropped her bag of crackers and began walking quickly toward the playground, her 7-year-old instincts telling her that something was very wrong, even if she didn't understand what it was. Tommy saw Sophie moving away and panicked. This wasn't how the plan was supposed to work. He was supposed to distract the nanny, not alert her to danger. He reached for his radio to signal Vincent, but Grace saw the movement and reacted instantly. "Sophie, run!" Grace shouted as she lunged toward Tommy. Grace had taken self-defense classes in college and had learned additional techniques during her 2 years working for another wealthy family in Miami. But more than training, she had something that Tommy and his partners hadn't counted on: the fierce, protective instinct of someone defending a child she loved like her own daughter. Sophie didn't hesitate. She broke into a full sprint toward the playground, her school shoes slapping against the concrete path. Behind her, she could hear Grace grunting and the sound of what seemed like fighting, but she didn't look back. Some deep instinct told her that looking back would slow her down, and right now, running was the most important thing she could do. Vincent Caruso emerged from behind the trees, abandoning stealth for speed. The plan was falling apart, but he still had a chance if he could reach Sophie before she got to the playground where the elderly man was sitting. Grace saw Vincent running toward Sophie and made a split-second decision that would change all their lives forever. She broke away from her struggle with Tommy, ignoring the sharp pain where his elbow had connected with her ribs, and sprinted after Vincent. Grace was fast, but Vincent had a head start and longer legs. Sophie was still 30 yards from the playground when Vincent caught up to her. "Sophie!" Grace screamed, pushing herself to run faster than she ever had in her life. Vincent grabbed Sophie around the waist, lifting her off the ground as she began screaming and kicking. The elderly man by the playground looked up from his newspaper, startled and confused by the sudden commotion. "Call 911!" Grace yelled to the old man as she closed the distance between herself and Vincent. Vincent was bigger and stronger than Grace, but he was also carrying a struggling 7-year-old who was surprisingly strong for her size. Sophie had inherited her father's determination and her mother's fierce spirit, and she wasn't going quietly. Grace reached them just as Vincent was trying to adjust his grip on Sophie. Without hesitation, she launched herself at Vincent's back, wrapping her arms around his neck and using her weight to throw off his balance. The three of them went down in a tangle of arms and legs on the grass near the playground. Sophie rolled away from the impact, scraping her knee on the concrete but immediately scrambling to her feet. "Run to the car, Sophie! Lock the doors!" Grace shouted as she fought to keep Vincent from getting up. But Sophie didn't run to the car. Instead, she picked up a large stick from under the oak tree and began hitting Vincent's legs with it, screaming, "Leave Mama Grace alone! Leave us alone!" Vincent finally managed to throw Grace off and stagger to his feet, but the delay had cost him everything. The elderly man had called 911. The woman who had been jogging was running toward them while shouting into her cell phone, and Tommy was already sprinting toward the van in the parking lot, abandoning his partners. Vincent looked at Grace, who was struggling to her feet with a cut on her forehead and grass stains on her clothes, then at Sophie, who was still brandishing her stick with tears streaming down her face but showing no signs of backing down. "This isn't over," Vincent snarled as he began backing toward the parking lot. Grace stepped in front of Sophie, her arms spread wide to shield the little girl from any further danger. "Yes, it is," she said firmly. "It's over." Vincent turned and ran toward the van, but Luis had already driven away, leaving his partners behind when he heard the sirens approaching in the distance. Vincent found himself stranded in the parking lot as police cars began converging on the scene. Grace knelt down and gathered Sophie into her arms, both of them shaking from adrenaline and fear. Sophie clung to Grace like she never wanted to let go, and Grace held her just as tightly. "Are you hurt, sweetheart? Are you okay?" Grace whispered into Sophie's hair. "I'm okay, Mama Grace. Are you hurt? Your head is bleeding." Grace touched her forehead and felt the wetness, but she didn't care about that right now. All that mattered was that Sophie was safe. "I'm fine, baby. I'm perfectly fine now that you're safe." As the police cars pulled into the parking lot and officers began running toward them, Sophie looked up at Grace with eyes that were older than her 7 years should have been. "Mama Grace, you saved me. You protected me just like real mamas do." Grace's heart broke and soared at the same time. "I will always protect you, Sophie. Always. I love you so much." "I love you too, Mama Grace. More than all the ducks in the whole world." 20 minutes later, as paramedics checked them both for injuries and police officers took their initial statements, Grace called Marcus's office. His assistant answered on the first ring, but Marcus was in the middle of his crucial board meeting. "I understand he's in an important meeting," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But he needs to know that someone just tried to kidnap Sophie. We're both safe, but he needs to come to Riverside Park immediately." There was a pause. Then the assistant's voice became sharp and focused. "I'll get him right now. Are you both really okay?" "We're okay. Sophie is scared but unhurt. I have some cuts and bruises, but nothing serious. The police arrested 2 men and they're looking for a third. Mr. Wellington will be there in 15 minutes. As Grace hung up the phone, she looked down at Sophie, who was sitting beside her on the back of an ambulance, holding an ice pack to a bruise on her arm. The little girl had been incredibly brave throughout the police questioning, answering their questions clearly and even helping them understand exactly what had happened. "Is Daddy coming?" Sophie asked. "Yes, sweetheart. He's on his way." Sophie nodded and leaned against Grace's side. "Mama Grace, will you still be my nanny after this? Sometimes when scary things happen, things change." Grace's throat tightened. Sophie was too young to understand the complexities of what might happen next. But she was old enough to sense that this event might alter their lives in ways they couldn't predict. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophie. As long as your daddy wants me to take care of you, I'll be right here." Sophie smiled for the first time since the attack began. "Good, because I think you're the best mama nanny in the whole world." In the distance, Grace could hear sirens growing louder as more police units arrived. But for the moment, sitting in the afternoon sunshine with Sophie safe beside her, she felt a fierce sense of pride and love that made all the fear and pain worth it. What Grace didn't know was that Marcus Wellington was about to learn something that would change not only how he saw her, but how he saw everything about his life and priorities. Marcus Wellington had never driven so fast in his life. He left his board meeting without explanation, ignoring the shocked faces of investors and executives as he grabbed his keys and ran from the conference room. The merger that was supposed to make him even wealthier suddenly seemed completely meaningless compared to his daughter's safety. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel of his Bentley, weaving through Atlanta traffic while images flashed through his mind. Sophie's bright smile that morning, Grace's gentle voice asking about the school play, the casual way he had dismissed both of them as he rushed off to his meeting. What if he had lost Sophie today? What if Grace hadn't been there to protect her? As he pulled into the Riverside Park parking lot, Marcus saw police cars, ambulances, and crime scene tape surrounding the area where his daughter had nearly been taken from him forever. The sight hit him like a physical blow, making him realize just how close he had come to losing everything that truly mattered. He spotted Grace and Sophie immediately. They were sitting on the back of an ambulance, Sophie leaning against Grace's side while a paramedic cleaned a cut on Grace's forehead. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that Grace was protective and alert. Her arm wrapped around Sophie, her eyes constantly scanning the area for any remaining threats. "Daddy!" Sophie called out when she saw him approaching. She jumped down from the ambulance and ran toward him with more energy than someone who had just survived a kidnapping attempt should have had. Marcus caught her in his arms, lifting her off the ground and holding her tighter than he ever had before. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The thought of what might have happened, of never being able to hold his daughter again, overwhelmed him completely. "Are you hurt, Princess? Are you really okay?" he whispered into her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of the strawberry shampoo Grace always used for Sophie's baths. "I'm okay, Daddy. Mama Grace saved me. She was so brave. She fought the bad man and told me to run, and then she called you right away so you wouldn't worry." Marcus looked up at Grace, who was still sitting on the ambulance with an ice pack pressed to her temple. There was a cut above her left eyebrow, grass stains on her clothes, and what looked like the beginning of a bruise on her left cheek. But her eyes were clear and focused. And when she looked at Sophie, Marcus saw something he had never noticed before: the unmistakable love of a mother protecting her child. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he approached her. "I don't know how to thank you. I can't even begin to—" "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Wellington," Grace said softly. "Sophie is safe. That's all that matters." Detective Sarah Chen, who had been leading the investigation, approached them with a notebook in her hand. She was a 15-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department and had seen enough attempted kidnappings to know how rarely they ended with both the child and caregiver unharmed. "Mr. Wellington, I need to speak with you about what happened here today, Detective Chen said. Your nanny's quick thinking and brave actions almost certainly saved your daughter's life. The men who attempted this kidnapping were professionals. They had been watching your family for weeks, learning your routines and waiting for the right opportunity. Marcus felt his blood run cold. Watching us for weeks? How is that possible? We have security systems, cameras. Home security systems are designed to detect people who break in, Mr. Wellington. These men never tried to enter your property. They studied your family's movements when you were out in public. They knew that your daughter went to Riverside Elementary, that Grace often brought her to this park, and that you would be in important meetings today. Detective Chen flipped through her notes. The leader, Vincent Caruso, is a recently released felon with connections to organized crime. He owed substantial money to dangerous people and saw kidnapping your daughter as his way out. The ransom demand was going to be $50 million. Marcus sat down heavily on the bench near the ambulance, the full weight of what had almost happened hitting him. $50 million was nothing compared to Sophie's life, but the thought that criminals had been watching his family, studying their habits, planning to take his daughter, it made him feel sick and furious and helpless all at once. What happens now? He asked. We arrested Caruso and his partner at the scene. The third man, the driver, abandoned them when he heard sirens, but we have his license plate and will find him. With Grace's testimony and Sophie's surprisingly clear account of what happened, we have more than enough evidence to put them away for a very long time. Detective Chen looked at Grace with obvious respect. Ma'am, I've been investigating crimes against children for over a decade, and I want you to know that what you did today was extraordinary. Most people freeze in situations like this, or they run for help and leave the child behind. You put yourself between armed criminals and that little girl without hesitating. That takes a special kind of courage. Grace shifted uncomfortably under the praise. Anyone would have done the same thing. Sophie is just a little girl. She needed someone to protect her. No, ma'am, Detective Chen said firmly. Not everyone would have done what you did. You risked your life for someone else's child. That's not just courage, that's love. Marcus looked at Grace again, this time really seeing her for perhaps the first time since she had started working for his family. She wasn't just an employee who took care of Sophie's schedule and made sure she ate her vegetables. She was someone who loved his daughter enough to fight off armed kidnappers. She was someone who called Sophie by a name that spoke to the deep bond between them. She was someone who had become family without him even realizing it. After giving their statements to the police and being cleared by the paramedics, Marcus drove Grace and Sophie home in thoughtful silence. Sophie fell asleep in her car seat, exhausted by the day's events. In the rearview mirror, Marcus could see Grace watching Sophie sleep, her hand gently stroking the little girl's hair. Grace, Marcus said quietly as they pulled into their driveway, we need to talk. After I get Sophie settled, could you meet me in my study? Grace nodded, though Marcus could see uncertainty in her eyes. He realized that she might be worried about her job, about whether he blamed her somehow for what had happened. The thought that she might think he was upset with her made him feel even worse about how little attention he had paid to the relationship between Grace and his daughter. An hour later, after Grace had helped Sophie with a bath and gotten her settled with a snack and a movie, she knocked softly on Marcus's study door. The room was lined with law books and business awards, dominated by a massive mahogany desk that had belonged to Marcus's grandfather. It was the kind of room designed to intimidate, to remind visitors of Marcus's power and success. But as Grace entered, Marcus was sitting in one of the smaller chairs by the window, not behind his imposing desk. He had changed out of his business suit into jeans and a sweater, and for the first time since Grace had started working for the family, he looked like someone's father rather than a billionaire CEO. Please sit down, Marcus said, gesturing to the chair across from him. How are you feeling? Are you sure you don't need to go to the hospital? That cut on your head looked serious. I'm fine, Mr. Wellington. The paramedic said it's just a surface wound. Head cuts always bleed more than they should. Marcus studied her face, noting the bruise that was darkening around her left eye and the way she winced slightly when she moved her left arm. Grace, I need you to know something. What you did today, protecting Sophie the way you did, I will never forget it. I will never be able to repay you for it. Grace shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Mr. Wellington, I just did what anyone would do. Sophie is a wonderful little girl and she was in danger. I couldn't just stand by and let something happen to her. That's exactly what I'm talking about, Marcus said, leaning forward. You keep saying that anyone would do what you did, but that's not true. The detective told me that most people panic in situations like that. Most people run for help or freeze up, but you didn't hesitate. You put yourself between my daughter and armed criminals without thinking about your own safety. Marcus paused, trying to find the right words for what he needed to say. Grace, I've been so focused on work for the past 2 years that I haven't been paying attention to what was happening in my own home. I hired you to take care of Sophie's schedule and her meals and her homework. I thought that was enough. But today I realized that you've been doing something much more important than that. You've been loving my daughter. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Wellington, I hope I haven't overstepped. I know Sophie isn't my child, and I never meant to— No, Marcus interrupted gently. You haven't overstepped anything. You've given Sophie something I didn't even realize she was missing. You've given her the kind of love and attention that I should have been giving her myself. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Catherine had once played with baby Sophie. When Catherine died, I threw myself into work because I didn't know how to deal with the grief. I thought that if I could just make enough money, build a big enough security net around Sophie, that would be enough. I thought providing for her financially was the same as taking care of her emotionally. He turned back to face Grace. But today, when I thought I might lose her, I realized that all the money in the world doesn't matter if I'm not actually present in her life. And I realized that the reason Sophie has been so happy these past 3 months isn't because of anything I've done. It's because of you. Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Sophie loves you so much, Mr. Wellington. She talks about you constantly. She just wants to spend time with you. She wants you to read her stories and come to her school play and hear about her day. She doesn't need expensive toys or fancy vacations. She just needs her daddy. I know that now, Marcus said quietly. And I want to change. I want to be the kind of father Sophie deserves. But I also want you to know that you're not just an employee in this house anymore, Grace. Today you proved that you're family. And I hope you'll stay with us for a very long time. Grace smiled through her tears. There's nowhere else I'd rather be, Mr. Wellington. Sophie has become like my own daughter. I can't imagine my life without her in it. There's one more thing, Marcus said, reaching into his desk drawer. The police told me that this kidnapping attempt was organized and professional. They think there might be other criminals who could target Sophie in the future. I want to hire additional security for the house, and I want to give you a substantial raise. Not because I think money can repay what you did today, but because I want you to know how valuable you are to this family. He pulled out an envelope and handed it to Grace. This is a bonus for today, and starting next month, I'm doubling your salary. I'm also setting up a college fund in your name, so you'll always have financial security no matter what happens in the future. Grace stared at the envelope, overwhelmed. Mr. Wellington, this is too much. I didn't do what I did for money. I did it because I love Sophie. I know you did, Marcus said. And that's exactly why you deserve this. Grace, you saved my daughter's life today. You risked everything to protect her. That kind of loyalty and love can't be bought, but it should be honored. That evening, Marcus did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He sat on Sophie's bed and read her 3 stories, listening to her excited chatter about the ducks at the park and her plans for the school play. When she finally fell asleep, her hand was holding his, and Marcus realized that this was where he belonged. Not in boardrooms making deals, but right here, being Sophie's father. As he quietly left Sophie's room, Marcus found Grace in the hallway, checking the locks on all the windows and doors. The events of the day had clearly affected her more than she wanted to admit, and Marcus could see that she was taking extra precautions to make sure Sophie would be safe through the night. "Grace," he said softly. "Thank you for everything, for saving Sophie today, for loving her the way you do, and for helping me remember what's truly important in life." Grace smiled, and for the first time since Marcus had known her, it wasn't the polite, professional smile of an employee. It was the warm, genuine smile of someone who had found her place in the world. "Thank you for trusting me with her, Mr. Wellington. Sophie is the most wonderful little girl I've ever known. Taking care of her doesn't feel like work. It feels like a gift." As Marcus headed to his own room, he made a mental note to call his assistant first thing in the morning and clear his schedule for the next 3 days. Sophie's school play was on Friday, and for the first time since Catherine's death, Marcus was going to be there for his daughter. Not because he had to be, but because he finally understood that being a father was the most important job he would ever have. What Marcus didn't know was that his decision to prioritize his family over his business was about to lead to discoveries that would change their lives in ways he could never have imagined. 3 days later, Marcus Wellington stood at the back of Riverside Elementary School's cafeteria, which had been transformed into a makeshift theater for the Autumn Festival play. Tiny chairs were arranged in rows for the parents, and a small stage area was decorated with construction paper leaves and cardboard trees. It was nothing like the corporate events Marcus usually attended, but he had never been more excited to be somewhere in his life. Sophie appeared on stage wearing her sunflower costume, a bright yellow circle around her head with petals made from felt, and a green dress that Grace had helped her decorate with fabric paint. She was the third sunflower from the left, and to Marcus, she was absolutely perfect. "Look at her," Grace whispered, sitting beside Marcus in the audience. "She's been practicing her lines for weeks. She knows everyone's parts, not just her own." Marcus smiled, watching his daughter beam with pride as she delivered her 2 lines about growing tall and strong in the garden. When Sophie spotted him in the audience, her face lit up so brightly that Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. He gave her an enthusiastic wave and a thumbs up, and Sophie giggled, almost forgetting her next cue. After the play, Sophie ran to Marcus and Grace with her arms spread wide, still wearing her sunflower costume. "Did you see me, Daddy? Did you hear my lines? I remembered everything." "You were amazing, Princess," Marcus said, lifting her into a hug. "You were the most beautiful sunflower on that entire stage." "Mama Grace helped me practice every single day," Sophie said, turning to include Grace in the conversation. "And she made my costume even prettier with the sparkles on the petals." Marcus looked at Grace, who was beaming with pride as if Sophie were her own daughter performing in her first play. Over the past 3 days, Marcus had watched the interactions between Grace and Sophie with new eyes, and what he saw both impressed and humbled him. Grace didn't just take care of Sophie's basic needs. She celebrated Sophie's small victories, listened to her fears and dreams, helped her work through problems with infinite patience, and made every ordinary day feel special. She was the kind of mother figure that every child deserved, and Marcus was beginning to realize that Sophie wasn't the only Wellington who had fallen in love with Grace Johnson. "Mr. Wellington?" Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, approached them with a warm smile. "I'm so glad you could make it to the play. Sophie has been talking about you coming for weeks." "I wouldn't have missed it for anything," Marcus replied, and he meant it completely. Mrs. Rodriguez looked at Grace and Sophie, who were discussing plans for celebrating at the ice cream parlor afterward. "You have such a lovely family, Mr. Wellington. Grace is always so involved in Sophie's school activities, and it's clear how much Sophie adores her. You're very fortunate." The word family hit Marcus with unexpected force. Mrs. Rodriguez had assumed that Grace was Sophie's mother, and the assumption didn't feel wrong at all. In fact, it felt more right than Marcus had expected. That evening, after they had celebrated with ice cream and Sophie had finally fallen asleep, still wearing her sunflower headpiece, Marcus found Grace in the kitchen, preparing Sophie's lunch for the next day. It was something she did every night, carefully cutting sandwiches into fun shapes and including little notes with encouraging words or silly drawings. "Grace, can we talk?" Marcus asked, pouring himself a cup of the coffee she had made. "Of course," Grace replied, finishing the note she was writing, a small drawing of a sunflower with "You were amazing today" written underneath. Marcus sat down at the kitchen island, watching Grace work with the same care and attention she brought to everything involving Sophie. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since Tuesday about my priorities, about what kind of father I want to be, about what kind of life I want Sophie to have." Grace set down her pen and gave him her full attention, though Marcus could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. "For the past 2 years, I've been so focused on building wealth and security for Sophie's future that I've been missing her present," Marcus continued. "I've been absent from her life in all the ways that actually matter. And I've been taking for granted the fact that you've been filling that void, giving her the love and attention that I should have been giving her myself." "Mr. Wellington, you're a wonderful father," Grace said softly. "You've been grieving and trying to do your best in an impossible situation. Sophie knows you love her." "Maybe she does, but that's not enough anymore," Marcus replied. "I want to be present in her life. I want to know about her friends and her favorite books and her dreams. I want to be the kind of father who doesn't miss school plays and bedtime stories. I want to be someone she can count on, not just financially but emotionally." Grace smiled. "She would love that. Sophie talks about you constantly. She's so proud that you're her daddy." Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would either be the best decision he had ever made or would complicate their lives in ways he couldn't predict. "Grace, there's something else I need to tell you. Over the past 3 days, watching you with Sophie, seeing how much you love her and how much she loves you, I've realized something important. You're not just Sophie's nanny anymore. You're not just an employee in this house. You've become essential to both of our lives in a way that goes far beyond any job description." Grace's cheeks flushed slightly, and Marcus could see that his words were affecting her in ways she was trying to hide. "What I'm trying to say is that I've fallen in love with you, Grace, not just because of what you did for Sophie on Tuesday, although that certainly showed me what an extraordinary person you are. I've fallen in love with your kindness, your strength, your integrity, and the way you make both Sophie and me feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves." Grace stared at him, clearly stunned by his confession. "Mr. Wellington, "Marcus," he interrupted gently. "My name is Marcus, and before you say anything, I need you to know that I'm not saying this because I'm confused or overwhelmed by recent events. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I don't want to waste any more time not being honest about what I'm feeling." Grace was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see her processing everything he had said. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, I've been in love with you for months. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just gratitude for this job and affection for Sophie, but it wasn't. Every day, I watch you work so hard to provide for Sophie. And I see how much you love her even when you don't know how to show it. I see how much you miss your wife and how hard you've been trying to be both mother and father to Sophie." She paused, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "But I also know that I'm your employee, and Sophie isn't my daughter. And there are so many reasons why this is complicated. Marcus reached across the counter and took her hand. Grace, you may have started as my employee, but you've never been just that. And Sophie may not be your biological daughter, but you love her like she is, and she loves you the same way. As for the complications, we can work through anything as long as we're honest with each other. Grace looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Marcus's face. What are you asking me, Marcus? I'm asking you to marry me, Marcus said, his voice steady and certain. I'm asking you to become Sophie's mother officially, not just in our hearts. I'm asking you to build a real family with us, to be my partner in life, not just my employee. Grace's eyes widened. Marcus, are you sure? This is all happening so fast, and you've been through so much trauma lately. Are you sure this isn't just gratitude or relief that Sophie is safe? Marcus stood up and walked around the counter to face her directly. Grace, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You've been part of our family for months, without any of us officially acknowledging it. You've been a mother to Sophie in every way that matters, and you've shown me that it's possible to love again, to trust again, to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. He took both of her hands in his. I'm not asking you to replace Catherine. She will always be Sophie's first mother and my first love. But I'm asking you to help us create something new, something that honors the past while embracing the future. Grace looked toward the stairs, thinking about Sophie sleeping peacefully in her room with her sunflower costume hanging carefully in the closet. What about Sophie? How do we know she'll be okay with this? What if she feels like we're trying to replace her mother? Sophie has been calling you Mama Grace for weeks, Marcus pointed out. She already thinks of you as her mother. And she's been asking me why I don't have a wife like her friend Emma's daddy does. I think she'll be thrilled. Grace laughed through her tears. She has been asking a lot of questions about families lately. Last week she asked me if people could choose their families. And when I said sometimes they could, she said she would choose you and me to be her family. Marcus smiled. Then we'll be giving her exactly what she wants. A complete family where everyone loves each other. Grace took a deep breath and looked into Marcus's eyes, seeing nothing but sincerity and love. Yes, she said softly. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll be Sophie's mother. I'll be your wife. I can't imagine wanting anything more than to build a life with you and Sophie. Marcus pulled Grace into his arms and kissed her. A kiss that tasted like new beginnings and promises kept. When they broke apart, they heard a small sound from the stairs. Sophie was sitting on the bottom step in her pajamas, grinning from ear to ear. Does this mean Mama Grace is going to be my real mama now? And you're going to be married like Emma's parents? Marcus and Grace looked at each other and laughed. How long have you been sitting there, young lady? Grace asked. Long enough, Sophie said, bouncing up and running to them. This is the best day ever. First I was a sunflower in the play, and now I get to have both a daddy and a mama who live in the same house. Marcus picked up Sophie and included her in their hug. What do you think, Princess? Are you okay with Grace becoming your official mama? Sophie looked seriously at Grace, then at Marcus, then back at Grace. Mama Grace, will you still read me stories and make my sandwiches with the funny shapes and take me to see the ducks? Every single day if that's what you want, Grace promised. And Daddy, will you still come to my school plays and help me with my math homework? I wouldn't miss it for anything in the world, Marcus replied. Sophie clapped her hands together. Then yes, I want us to be a real family. Can we have a wedding with a big cake? Can I wear a pretty dress? Can the ducks from the park come to the wedding? Grace and Marcus looked at each other over Sophie's head, both thinking the same thing. That they had found something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them desperately needed. They had found love, security, and the kind of family that was built not just on blood relations, but on choice, commitment, and daily acts of love. 6 months later, Marcus and Grace were married in the garden behind the Wellington house, under the oak tree where Catherine had once planted flowers. Sophie served as the maid of honor, wearing a yellow dress that matched her sunflower costume, and she insisted that they release ducks into the garden pond as part of the ceremony. The wedding was small and intimate, attended only by close friends and family members who had watched the three of them become a unit over the past months. Detective Chen attended, bringing her own children to meet the little girl whose bravery had impressed her so much. Mrs. Rodriguez came with several of Sophie's classmates, and even Henry, the family driver, served as Marcus's best man. But the most meaningful moment came during the vows, when Marcus and Grace each made a promise not just to each other, but to Sophie. They pledged to love her, protect her, and help her grow into the amazing woman they could already see she was becoming. After the ceremony, as guests mingled in the garden and Sophie showed her friends the ducks in the pond, Marcus found Grace sitting under the oak tree, still wearing her wedding dress but with grass stains on the hem from chasing Sophie around the yard. "No regrets?" he asked, sitting beside his new wife. Grace looked at Sophie, who was explaining to the other children about how ducks make their families, then at Marcus, who looked happier and more relaxed than she had ever seen him. "Not a single one," she said, taking his hand. "This feels like exactly where I'm supposed to be." Marcus squeezed her hand and watched their daughter, because Sophie was truly their daughter now, legally and in every way that mattered, teach her friends how to properly feed the ducks. A year earlier, Marcus had thought that success meant having the biggest bank account and the most impressive business deals. Now he knew that success meant sitting in his own backyard, watching his wife and daughter laugh together, knowing that he had finally figured out what was truly worth fighting for. The kidnapping attempt that had nearly destroyed their world had instead led them to build something stronger and more beautiful than any of them could have imagined. Grace's courage in protecting Sophie had revealed the depth of her love, but more importantly, it had opened Marcus's eyes to what real family looked like. As the sun set over their wedding reception, casting golden light through the garden where three separate lives had become one unified family, Marcus realized that the best investments weren't the ones that made money. The best investments were the ones that created love, built trust, and turned a house into a home where everyone belonged completely and unconditionally. Sophie ran over to them, her yellow dress now thoroughly rumpled and her face bright with joy. "Mama, Grace, Daddy, look! The baby ducks are following their mama and daddy just like I follow you." Grace and Marcus exchanged a look of perfect understanding. They had started as strangers brought together by circumstances, but they had chosen to become a family. And that choice, made every day through small acts of love and commitment, had created something more valuable than all the money in the world. "That's right, sweetheart," Grace said, pulling Sophie onto her lap. "Families stick together and take care of each other no matter what." "Forever and always," Marcus added, wrapping his arms around both of his girls. "Forever and always," Sophie repeated solemnly, then giggled and wiggled out of their embrace to chase fireflies that were beginning to appear in the gathering dusk. As they watched their daughter play in the garden where they had just promised to love each other for the rest of their lives, Marcus and Grace knew that they had found something that no amount of money could buy and no threat could destroy. They had found home.